The fuck going on with y'all, man, and welcome to the best sorcerer leveling guide for Diablo 4. In this guide, we're going to talk about the skills and enchantments used for the build, the type of gear to get and what stats to get on them, the Codex of Power and the best legendary aspect to level with, how to level from levels 1 to 50, and a few tips and tricks that should be additionally helpful to your Diablo 4 experience. The character you see on the screen is my level 50 sorcerer in World Tier 2 fighting the Capstone dungeon boss in order to unlock World Tier 3. As you can see, it does damage, has mobility and defense, and is fairly easy to play. Now that you know what you can look forward to, let's get into the guide. Alright, so as you can see here, I have fully mapped out what skill points to get every time you level up and what enchantments to slot in at levels 15 and 30. Now let's talk about the skills and why you get them in the first place. Arc Lash is our basic left click skill. We want to use this whenever we don't have any mana to use Chain Lightning. However, occasionally this ability will stun on hit, which is useful for fighting packs of mobs, stunning elites, or filling up the stagger bar against bosses. Chain Lightning is our main damage skill. If you got mana, use this ability. Unfortunately, you will experience mana problems. Luckily, we have a way to fix that with a certain legendary aspect, which we'll talk about later in the guide. Teleport is our movement skill. Pretty self-explanatory here. If you want to go fast, use it. If you want to get out of a shitty spot, use it. Ice Armor is an extremely strong defensive skill. It basically gives you a barrier that can cover your whole HP pool. However, it does decay over time and has a cooldown, so you'll want to use this just as you're about to engage in a fight. Frost Nova is probably the most important skill in this build. 1. It freezes everything except for bosses, which includes elites, by the way. 2. It's actually fine that it doesn't freeze bosses, because it applies a much more important debuff, Vulnerable. Vulnerable is one of the best damage stats in the game, and I'm pretty sure every class uses it. But again, Frost Nova has a cooldown, so make sure you use it wisely. And finally, Unstable Currents. This is our big cooldown. If you're surrounded by 3 elites or about to fight the final boss in a dungeon, pop everything, including this, and start whacking away. What this skill does is basically, every time you use a shock skill, which is Arc Lash, Chain Lightning, or Teleport, you randomly cast another shock skill. So eventually, your screen will be filled up with a bunch of random ass spells you didn't even know you had, absolutely obliterating everything around you. For our key passive, we use Ver's Mastery because it has great offensive and defensive buffs that synergize with our shock skills. Now let's talk about the enchantment system. At levels 15 and 30, you unlock enchantment slots that add additional effects to your skills. For Chain Lightning, after spending 100 mana, you basically cast an additional Chain Lightning. Now for our second enchantment, we take Firebolt. I know. You're probably wondering, what the fuck is Firebolt doing here? Well, it's pretty simple. Firebolt, on its own, does nothing. But Firebolt's enchantment lets us apply burning damage to all our attacks, which gives us an extra layer of damage to scale. Alright, now that we've gone over the skills portion of the guide, let's move on to the next part. Now, normally, there was one rule when it comes to leveling gear, and that is, green is good. When you're comparing items and there is more green than red, just put it on. The reason for this is because your leveling gear will be replaced anyway with the gear that you get from World Tier 3 and beyond. But, just in case, if you're a person like me who actually cares about stats, then here's what I would recommend. For weapons, it is preferred to use a wand and a focus over a two-handed staff because they give more stats, and focus can roll cooldown reduction, which is arguably the most important stat for this build because of our long-ass cooldowns. But if you do end up finding a high DPS two-handed staff, then just go ahead and use that. For armor, normally you're just looking for gear that gives you the best defensive stats. However, there are certain stats that are just way more important. Cooldown reduction helps with the build as a whole because half of our skills have long ass cooldowns. Chain Lightning ranks on gloves improves Chain Lightning even further, and movement speed on our boots allow us not to be so damn slow. For jewelry, we're going to focus on offensive stats, such as critical strike damage, critical strike chance, and vulnerable damage. Quite possibly the 3 strongest offensive stats in the game. And finally, here are the sockets that we're going to use for our gear. Topaz for weapons, increasing arc lash damage, rubies for armor, giving us more life, and skulls for jewelry, giving us more armor. And now that we've covered the gear portion of the guide, let's move on to the Codex of Power. The Codex of Power is where you can imprint and extract legendary aspects. These legendary aspects can make or break a build. For this build, we have severe mana problems, and to help with this, especially against bosses, we use the recharging resource aspect, which gives us mana every time chain lightning bounces off ourselves, and in a 1v1 scenario, it will do that a lot. You can obtain this legendary aspect in the Zenith dungeon located in the Fractured Peaks region, and luckily this location isn't too far off from the early game storyline. However, I would hold off on imprinting this aspect on an item until you've obtained a legendary ring of some sort. The reason why is because using the Codex of Power is pretty expensive, so we have to make sure it's worth it. Luckily, the campaign drops multiple legendary items throughout, so it shouldn't be too hard getting your hands on one. Alright, now that you know what legendary aspect to use, let's go into the leveling process. First off, I gotta say that there are plenty of ways to level in this game. The way that I'm going to show you is how I did it, combining efficiency of experience and fun from the game. Here we go. From levels 1 through 30, just do the campaign. Eventually you'll find yourself underleveled, and if you feel uncomfortable with that, then feel free to do some side quests and or dungeons. However, the main story is pretty easy, so you really shouldn't have much trouble at all. From levels 30 through 40, you are going to run around on your mount and get all the waypoints, do all the strongholds, and touch all the altars of Lilith. Now I know this may sound like a lot, but doing all this will not only increase the strength of your current character, but any other character you create in the future. And finally, from levels 40 to 50, you're gonna do whatever the Tree of Whispers tells you to do. I actually like this part of the endgame because you get to explore areas and dungeons that you haven't yet, and you get some nice rewards from the tree as well, like experience and items. Oh yeah, the last thing I should mention for the leveling process is that you should just stay in World Tier 1. World Tier 2 is just not worth it, because the amount of time it takes you to kill the mobs is not worth the amount of XP and gold that it gives you. So expect to go from World Tier 1 to World Tier 3 once you're ready to reach endgame. Alright, let's wrap up this guide with some tips and tricks. Because this build has very long cooldowns, you don't want to fight big packs or elite mobs one by one. If you can, gather 2 or 3 of them and then pop all your big stuff to make the cooldowns worth it. Next, make sure you level up your potion. Luckily, there is a little up arrow icon whenever you're high enough level to upgrade your potion to let you know, so make sure you do that. Pick up all the materials that you see throughout the world, all the gallow wines, the bit berries, all that stuff, the ores, all that stuff matters eventually, so make sure you pick all of them up. Speaking of materials, salvage everything. Only during the leveling process though, because I want to make a note that after you do reach endgame, you are going to sell items to the vendor occasionally because gold does matter. As far as elixirs go, use them if you got them, because you could just make more anyway, if you're picking up materials that is. And on golden materials, don't spend either. Do not spend any gold or materials during the leveling process, because if you buy gear or if you imprint gear, the only thing you should be imprinting is your amulet for the resource, or sorry, is a ring for the resource recharging aspect. You shouldn't be spending gold, you shouldn't be spending materials otherwise, because you'll be mostly doing that in the end game when the gear matters. And last but not least, do not imprint your weapon. Do not imprint your weapon, because they will constantly be upgraded throughout the leveling process. I mean, really, you shouldn't be imprinting anything at all except for your ring for the resource aspect anyway. And there we have it. That concludes the best sorcerer leveling guide for Diablo 4. And hey, if you guys enjoyed the video and or found it helpful, then I'm glad. I plan to make leveling guides for all the classes in Diablo 4, and so far I've made a rogue one and this one. Next is Necromancer, baby. I also plan to make the best endgame build guides on each of the classes as well. So, if you're interested in anything Diablo 4, throw me a sub, won't you? Other than that, thank you so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. And remember to stay a while and listen. Peace out.